When we talk about churches in Lackagh, initially here in the parish, we understand that there was a mass rock, which was situated in a rock that's just basically across the road from the church, a little bit over the road. In fact, people maintain that it was halfway between where the old church was and where the present church is. And then that was replaced by the Church of St. Columkill, and there's a photograph of that just there. And then in later years, there was a church built, and there's record of it. It was a thatched church that went on fire in the 1830s, and there's no longer any ruin of that around. But it was located just west of where Carnonian Castle was, and unfortunately Carnonian Castle is also gone now. But that was just to the rear and to the west of where the present church is. And where the present church is a church that was built in 1839 by Father Thomas Carney. And there's a photograph of that, both exterior and interior here. And that stood proudly, and a lot of that thankfully is still there. That was stood proudly in the parish from 1839. There was an extension built to it, and a gallery built in 1939, and there was a bell tower built in 1939. And then in 1970 there was a new church opened, and an extension built onto it, and that's up here on the top. Just behind me. And then there a couple of years ago under Father Des Welsh, there was another extension put onto that where the church was done up and it was re-roofed where work needed to be done. While we've had a rich history with regard to churches, sort of the interior of churches and what went on was basically the same. And there were a lot of things that were important, not alone in the church, but also in houses. And in every church you found candlesticks, and you see candlesticks here. There was also candlesticks, of course, in every home, because there needed to be something holding the candles. Now, in places that couldn't afford candlesticks, the candle would be left on a saucer, and the wax would drop into it, and they'd, in fact, just burn a little bit of wax to stick the candle into the saucer. The blessed candles that were used in the church, and they were blessed on the 2nd of February every year on Candlemas Day. Nearly every house, in my youth, nearly every house would bring candles to the church on that day. They'd bring 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, so they came in packets of 6s. Some people might bring 2 packets, but they always brought 1 home with them. And when they brought the candle home, the candle was lit for all sorts of occasions in the house. If there was somebody sick in the house, the blessed candle was lit. If there was a thunderstorm, the blessed candle was lit. If there was anybody doing exams, applying for the job or anything like that, the blessed candles were lit. And the blessed candle was an integral part with the candlestick in almost every single house. Also here beside me, you see a little lamp, a little red lamp, and that was the Sacred Heart lamp that was always put in front of a picture of the Sacred Heart in every house that you went to. Of course, it was also in the church, because the Sacred Heart light, or the sanctuary light as it was often called, was always there in the church. Now, also here beside me you have a bell, and the bell was always ringing in the church. And as we mentioned bell, I suppose there was 2 types of bells. There was the outside one, which was pulled with a rope. We as altar service, or mass services were then, it's altar service now, had the job of going down to the end of the church, catching the rope, swinging off it and pulling it about 10 minutes before Mass, just to remind people that it was time to come into the church. And then, of course, during Mass, the bell was rung on a couple of different occasions. Ironically, on Holy Thursday, the bell was rung during the Gloria, and it wasn't rung. It didn't ring again until Mass on Easter Sunday, because during those sacred days of the Passion of our Lord, the bell wasn't rang. Now, what we used to do for consecration is that we had a little mallet or a little stick with the end of an ash plant, and we used to hit it against the timber flooring that was around the altar. And that was the way of reminding people that it was consecration time or whatever. But the bell wasn't used during those particular days. Now, if we move from here and just move across to this side, just along here we have a number of novena books and various things like that, but I suppose the important thing here is that we have a copy of the old catechism book. And of course the catechism book we were all taught at school, and I suppose for some of us it was the case, it was fleeced into us. It was the first form of learning that any child had, is when you went to school, and the catechism had to be learned from one end to the other. It was before there was any sort of Bibles or anything like that introduced. The catechism was the most important thing that was there. Also along here, there's a number of novena books of different shapes and sizes. There is also here a centenary book, the time that Pope John Paul visited Ireland. And of course, he came to Galway, which is just 8 miles from here. And that was certainly a very, very important occasion for everyone. Now, in the lower shelf here, there is beads and a purse that was made by a prisoner in Mountjoy jail during the Troubled Times. And it's allegedly one of the smallest beads that was ever made at the time. And it's just here, and it was donated here by the parish. Also here we have pioneer pins. And the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association was formed here in 1828 by a priest, the first curate that ever came to the parish, of Father Joe Ryan. And he was the man that started the Pioneer Association in the parish. There was an extremely strong Pioneer Association in the parish over many years. There's a leaflet from the time that the renovated church was opened in 1970, and it was rededicated under the name of Our Lady of Knock. And that was on the 8th of December 1970, and it was done by a priest, Father Peter Loftus. Here, because it was donated to Our Lady of Knock, there is a centenary medal from Knock, which came out in 1979, which was the 100th anniversary of the apparition at Knock. And also along here, we have funeral rites. One is Father Joe Scott. We also have Father Michael Lyons. Now, in this parish, when it comes to priests, from 1842, when Father Thomas Kearney, the man that built the original church, when he died in 1842, there was no other priest buried in this parish until 1966, when Father Tom Lynch, or Canon Tom Lynch, died. And the reason for that, we're told, is that as priests were getting older, because of the size of the parish, that they were moved to another parish, to a smaller parish, and they generally died in that parish, and they were buried in the parish that they died in. Now, Father Tom Lynch came here in the 1920s, and he was here with us until 1966. And many of the older people would tell you, well, he also put the fear of God into a lot of people. But mind you, I served Mass for him for a long time. I got on reasonably all right with him. I was called Yumugya on many occasions. But having said that, he was the first priest that was buried in the parish here since 1842, when he was buried in 1966. Father Peter Loftus, who was the man responsible for the renovation of the church and the opening of the church in 1970, he unfortunately died 5 weeks later, and he's also buried in the parish. And they were the only two parish priests that have been buried here as acting parish priests in the parish since the 1800s. But also buried here in this parish is, and there's a funeral right there, of Father Michael Lyons. And Father Michael Lyons served in this parish from 1981 to 1993, and he was an absolutely dynamic individual, and he was the man that's responsible for this museum here. And his funeral rite is buried here because he wanted to be buried here in this parish, because it was a parish that he served diligently, but it was also a parish that he in particular loved. He retired in Kilbennan in later years. Also here is the only curate that died in the parish, is the funeral rite of Father Joe Scott. And Joe Scott served here in the parish. He was extremely well liked. He was a native of Lackagh, just outside Westport, and he's buried in Louisburg in his native parish. But he died after a very short illness here in this parish in 1974, and his funeral rite is there as well. And even as we see in many cases now, in some places they will always know the priest, and in more cases nobody will know a priest, or only a handful will know a priest in a parish. But there's always a rich history in a parish, and this parish has certainly been full of it over the years with regard to the church.